longest conflict waged by Russia since the 17th century. Only World War One and World War Two are now more costly in modern Russian or Soviet history, and an inglorious ratio of losses to gains, a sort of phrase that stood out for me. And that's what we know, of course, the sort of the glacial progress they make for the return on losses is huge and probably not sustainable. And we say that's not sustainable because we know that in 2025 they met their remit of recruiting 409,000 people. That is the same number of people that they want to recruit this year. That doesn't give them a strategic reserve. It just fills the order of battle where they are on the ground. Therefore, they don't have the ability to have a fundamental new offensive operations at scale.
Once again, we're seeing Donald Trump being humiliated. He turned around and said when he introduced this sort of pseudo ceasefire that there would be no rockets or attacks until at least the 5th of February. And as you quite rightly described, we've had one of the largest ballistic and cruise missile attacks on Kyiv on the coldest night, or across Ukraine on the coldest night of the year. We've also seen, in recent days, a drone attack on a bus in Dnipropetrovsk, which killed 12 miners. We've seen a civilian train being struck in Kharkiv. Is Putin deliberately trying to push the boundaries with Trump to see how far he can get? And why do you think Trump isn't responding and going, hang on, you're not keeping up to your side of the bargain. I'm going to come down hard on you.
Well, no one knows the mercurial mind of Donald Trump, and I think that's the problem. It seems to me that one of the key things I thought would be the key things was Lindsey Graham on the 6th of January saying that Trump had greenlit the sledgehammer sanctions at 500%. That would be very impactful on Russia in the same way that what could be impactful today is seemingly that the Americans have done a tariff deal with India, bringing the tariff down from 50% to 18% and looking to not sell Russian oil to India, and that oil being replaced by Venezuelan oil, for example. That could be impactful. But it's almost at the moment that we've got to the point where it's a sort of rerun of the November position where, from Trump's perspective, it was, you've got 1 week to settle. So what would be interesting, I think, in Abu Dhabi this week is, again, whether it is give Donbass or there'll be no security guarantees. That seems to be the way the Americans are going at the moment. Again, part of that pressure strategy to reward Russia and get Ukraine to concede. We're no further down that line of trying to unblock that. And that's, as I said, to my mind, this is not a issue of land. It's that fundamental issue about sovereignty. But I think that is, of course, the real macro geopolitical problem that Trump doesn't really look at things in terms of sovereignty. That's why we've had all the nonsense about Canada as the 51st state and, Greenland I'll invade Greenland and it'll become the 52nd state. I mean, it's just, the chicken bones of the international order have been sort of thrown in the air. We're not quite sure where they're going to come down in the future. What we do know, of course, is that hard power matters. And that's what both Donald Trump and Putin have really shown in the last few years.
Well, hard power in terms of security guarantees is something that will be vital to Ukraine should it sign up to any peace agreement. And some of the detail that I've seen being discussed today and how accurate this is, I'm not sure. But it was talking of if there was a ceasefire and a peace agreement, if it was broken by one side or the other, then there'd be a stiff letter sent as the initial reaction. Then the second bit would be the military forces on the ground from the peacekeeping or peace monitoring or peace enforcement. Nobody's decided what the mission is. Forces would then take action, and only on the third day or 72 hours and beyond, if the action was sustained, would America then become involved in any sort of peace enforcement and therefore underpinning any security guarantee. Do you think we could trust the Americans?
Well, I think you need to get to some sort of position where you have this tiering of the security guarantees. And essentially, we know from the previous negotiations, there's slightly more detail, as you described there, Philip. But there's three layers. The first one is the Ukrainian armed forces, and that's why they won't accept any caveat on the size. There were this previous notion in negotiations that they would go down to a pretty small number, but now we're talking about 800,000, with the second tier being the coalition of the willing and the third tier being the Americans. Can you trust the Americans? Under Trump, that is really difficult to do. And there's one concept in international relations called rebus sic stantibus, which is you can abrogate any treaty if it's not in your interest. And of course, Trump has broken a number of treaties when he's been president, the top three really, one of which is actually potentially coming back to haunt him at the moment. So the top three are the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. He was the one who rescinded the agreement to limit the enrichment potential of the Iranian nuclear program. The second one was the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces, and the third one was under T1. He came out of the Paris climate change agreement. Biden went in. He's also rescinded that in his second term. So he's not got a great track record. So, like most of the things, when you meet someone, you ask yourself two questions. Do I like this person and do I trust this person? You might sort of think Trump is a sort of out of thigh slap man. What an interesting guy he is, but would you trust him? It's difficult at the moment to say you would absolutely. Now, one would hope there are systems behind Trump which would caveat that. Particularly, I think what we're going to see this year is some of the what falls out between the power of the executive and the power of the legislative, and where the power really does lie. Because, of course, at the moment it's being concentrated in the executive in the form of Trump. But I think we'll get an indication of that this month when one of the recurring security forums that we always look to. We've already had the sort of Davos in terms of the economic one, where we had a rambling speech by Trump. The one to look for this month is the Munich Munich security arrangement, which is from the 13th to 15th of February this year. We don't actually know yet who's going from the American perspective, but it's whether we're going to get another sort of telling off by Vance or someone like Vance as we had last year, and where that therefore leaves Ukraine and Europe for the future.
Well, the one thing we know it'll lead is starting the fifth year of this particular conflict. And if we look at the Russian casualties at the moment, the Center for Strategic and International Studies releasing the data, and it's very similar to the data we're getting out of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, suggests that today, as we're recording this, Russian casualties are about to reach 1.25 million. How do you think Putin is managing to get away with those sorts of numbers when a small fraction of that is what forced the Russians out of Afghanistan?
Well, I think I've read the report, and there's some really, really interesting lines in it, and things that you sort of scratch your head about. The longest conflict waged by Russia since the 17th century. Only World War One and World War Two are now more costly in modern Russian or Soviet history, and an inglorious ratio of losses to gains. A sort of phrase that stood out for me, and that's what we know. Of course, the sort of the glacial progress they make for the return on losses is huge and probably not sustainable. And we say that's not sustainable because we know that in 2025 they met their remit of recruiting 409,000 people. That is the same number of people that they want to recruit this year. That doesn't give them a strategic reserve. It just fills the ORBAT, or the order of battle, where they are on the ground. Therefore, they don't have the ability to have a fundamental new offensive operations at scale unless they take rob Peter to pay Paul, which of course also gives opportunities to Ukraine. How can they sustain that, and why is that possible? Well, I think we've spoken many times about what means that why do wars stop, and one of the reasons, of course, is the population, as they did in Afghanistan with the sort of the white widows or Russian widows coming out in force. That's really altered. So we now have a Russian population. This also is in the Center for Strategic and International Studies paper that is politically passive, heavily policed, and dissent has been dismantled under the 25 years of authoritarian dictatorship of Putin. And I think that's also an interesting one when we look at what is, for example, going on in Iran with the sort of internet kill switch being put there and the sort of only real sort of partial intranet being used in Iran. And that is the same sort of thing that Russia's been able to do or can do. So you're not going to have this sort of defection of the population revolting against this at the moment. There's no sign that the military is also in a position to revolt. And we've certainly seen no elite defection from those in the coterie that surround Putin. So it still seems fairly secure at the moment. Now, I've also said a number of times, though, that a tight grip is not necessarily the same as a stable grip. And we really don't know, I think, how fragile things are on the economic line for the Russians. How fragile really is that? Can they sustain their operations for a number of years still? Now, again, in my view, we don't know the answer to that because of the variables about support from outside agencies, including China. If you can break some of that, and maybe the oil going to India will be part of that breakage, then you're talking about different variables which may alter the calculus for Putin. But at the moment, he will keep going, and he still thinks he will be successful. He has no desire to end the war. Neither does he think he's under sufficient pressure from America, who are probably the only ones who could do it, to do so.